I didn't think I'd be saying this, but I thought Wonka was pretty terrible. There are some good moments, a few, very few good moments, but in general, I thought this was a tremendous disappointment. This, of course, was released in 2023, and I was really excited to see it, but not enough to pay for it as soon as it came on streaming. It was really expensive, well, moderately expensive for quite a while, and I was holding out for it to come onto Netflix or Prime. It hasn't still, but I am now resubscribed to Now TV to watch a couple of other films, so this is the perfect time to watch it. And in general, I'd say it really wasn't worth the wait. This is directed by Paul King. It is, of course, based on the story by Roald Dahl, and the characters by Roald Dahl, and the screenplay is by Paul King and Simon Farnaby. And we have an amazing cast. We have Timothée Chalamet, we have Matt Lucas, Sally Hawkins, Rowan Atkinson, Jim Carter, Olivia Colman, Hugh Grant. Brilliant, brilliant cast. The performances are very good, but I don't care for how Wonka is written, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But there are quite a few reasons why I was disappointed. The story is basically Wonka's origin story, and how there are some greedy chocolatiers trying to run everything, and he's not happy with this. And we have the character of Slughorn, and that's one of the reasons why I didn't care for this. Well, two reasons. One, the narrative is tremendously boring. I could not care less about anything in this story. But I also don't like Slughorn, and that's not unique to this film. I don't know why I remember this so vividly. Maybe a tiny part of it was an element of fear, but I remember even watching Willy Wonka, Gene Wilder's Wonka, as a child, absolutely detesting the scenes with Slughorn. And maybe it was fear, but I really just did not care. And that's carried through into my adulthood. I could not care less about Slughorn. And that's quite a central focus to this narrative. So that meant that the story for me was just really, really dull. So the narrative, don't care for it. I don't think it worked well. I don't think it was the right story to tell. Then we have the visuals. I think the visuals are incredibly boring. This seemed like it was going to be a bright, vibrant, colourful experience. And for the most part, it isn't. We have a very dull colour palette. We have a lot of browns and greys. And in general, that's not a bad thing. But looking at this film, it seemed like it was going to be so vivid, so bright, so mesmerising to look at. And apart from a few tiny moments, that's absolutely not the case from start to finish. I found it to be really boring to look at. So the story's dull. Visually, it's not interesting. I don't like the character of Wonka. There are only 2 moments in the entire film where I thought, yeah, that's Willy Wonka. That's the character we're watching. And one could argue, well, he wasn't always the Wonka that we know to love when he's giving kids tours of his factory. Obviously, over time, he's going to turn into that character. But there were only 2 scenes where I saw even a glimmer of the Wonka we go on to know and love. And that's nothing against Timothée Chalamet's performance. I think he did a great job with the material he had, but it's not Wonka. It really isn't, apart from 2 scenes, and I will mention at the end what those scenes are, as I don't want to spoil it. So the narrative's dull. Visually, it's very dull. Willy Wonka does not seem like Willy Wonka. He is nowhere near interesting enough to be Wonka. And then we have the music, and the music is pretty forgettable. There are a couple of songs that I liked. I'd say I kind of liked You've Never Had Chocolate Like This. In fact, I did. I did like that song. Oompa Loompa, absolutely. And Pure Imagination. I'd say those are the only decent songs in this. The rest of them are not bad, but they're not memorable. They're not engaging. I wasn't either drawn in emotionally or bopping along to the music or whatever kind of response I'm supposed to have. I just didn't. I didn't care. I didn't like it. I didn't dislike it. It wasn't uncomfortable to listen to, but the music is also, for the most part, really, really dull. And I will say, in terms of the story as well, the first hour, and it's just under 2 hours, the first hour was tedious. It was horrendously boring. I didn't enjoy any of it. And then about an hour into it, things started to get a little bit more interesting, not enough to save the film, but it started to feel more like what I expected from the film and from a film about the character of Willy Wonka. Never enough for me to be ultimately satisfied with it, but it does get slightly better as it goes along. So in general, it ticks very few boxes. The performances are fine. The cast is amazing. I like the main Willy Wonka outfit. I think they did a really great job with designing that costume, and I can confirm that costume. I will look at who did the costume while I'm rambling. The costume is absolutely beautiful. Basically, it's one of those films where all of the good stuff is in the trailer, and what's delivered is absolutely nothing like what it promised. Costume design is by Lindy Hemming. Beautiful costume for the main costume for Wonka, the one that's on all of the marketing. Absolutely gorgeous. And other than that, a few set designs are quite nice. None of the set designs are bad, but they're certainly not worthy of a Wonka film. So it's a huge, huge disappointment, and honestly, I thought it was pretty terrible, certainly for the first hour. After that, it slightly started to pick up, but I don't like how the character is written. The narrative is very boring. The songs are, for the most part, forgettable. Visually, it is incredibly dull to look at. It doesn't really have anything to offer. On the one hand, I wasn't surprised to learn that there is a sequel in development, according to Wikipedia. And on the other hand, I'm kind of surprised as well, because what is the sequel going to tell? Well, part of me is curious to find out, actually. But having said all of this, and basically saying that Wonka is an absolute disappointment, I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what the sequel is like, because at the very, very end of this film, I won't say what happens just now, but at the very end, it ever so slightly started to feel like what I thought it was going to be like. So if they carry that energy into the sequel, it could actually be decent. And if the sequel, and this is purely speculation, if the sequel tells the story of the ending of this film up until, for example, when he puts the tickets into the chocolate bars, or at least sometime in between then and then, I feel like that would be interesting. And we can just forget that this film exists, because I just think it's absolutely terrible. The narrative is horrendously boring. Visually, it's disappointing. The music is very bland. But if they can carry the energy of the last couple of scenes into the sequel, then maybe we can just make that Wonka's origin story and forget about this. Yes, we kind of need to know how the factory came about, but I'd rather they just told us that in a quick 10-minute overview of the narrative of this film. Personally, I would have preferred that. So, very disappointing. Not a very good film at all. Visually, so disappointing. The music is boring. Wonka doesn't feel like Wonka for the most part. But I will now mention the two scenes, and I made a note of them because I was pleasantly surprised. The two scenes where I felt like, actually, this is starting to feel like what I was expecting. So this is, I guess, a spoiler for two things that happen, and for me, probably the two best moments in the film. Also, I just want to mention Hugh Grant as an Oompa Loompa is a very odd experience. I don't know if that was the right decision. I'm not saying that Hugh Grant didn't do a good job, but I don't know why they decided to cast Hugh Grant as the Oompa Loompa. It just feels a bit bizarre, and I think, if anything, if they were going to go down a route of not casting somebody the height of the Oompa Loompa in the role of the Oompa Loompa, which is obviously what they wanted to do, then I think it would have been better if they went down the CGI route. It just feels less bizarre. Maybe that's just me. It's not a huge deal. I don't have too many strong opinions on that, but it's just something I wanted to mention. Okay, the last things I have to say are those two scenes where I thought, yeah, this is okay. So the first scene, quite far into the film, is when he finds out that the chocolate has been poisoned, and there's just about to be panic because everybody's been eating this chocolate, and Wonka seemed quite erratic in the way that the character often does in the films, and he just seemed a lot more like his own personality, and the chaos seemed a lot more in keeping with what we know from just the chaos that follows Wonka around. And that was a decent scene. And the ending, the very, very end, when the factory is starting to take shape, beautifully done. That part of it was very well done, but it lasts about 15 seconds, and we get Wonka getting excited about putting the factory together and getting excited about his creations, and that part at the very end I thought was exactly what I felt the film should have been like. We should have had that excitement, that energy, that kind of Wonka. And yes, again, one can argue that he had to go on this journey to become this person, but I don't agree with that. I think this is just who Wonka is, but he wasn't for the bulk of the film. But if they can carry that energy into the sequel, maybe there will be some okay things in store. I will absolutely reserve judgment on the sequel until we find out more. That's if it's even happening. I just read this briefly on Wikipedia. I didn't look too much into it. But I think they'll need to make some very different decisions if they're going to do a sequel. And I think it needs to be significantly better to be a decent film, because Wonka was a tremendous letdown. The only thing that worked well, really well, were the cast and performances. Visually, very ugly to look at for the most part. The songs were mostly forgettable, and I thought the narrative was very, very boring. So I was really looking forward to it. I had very high hopes, and at this point, I feel like it shouldn't have even existed. If it gets us to a sequel that's actually brilliant, maybe I'll change my mind on that. But for now, I thought Wonka was actually a pretty terrible film.